March 4, 1944, 7:23 a.m. RAF Duxford, Cambridgeshire, England. The morning air tastes of Argosson dew. Ground crews move through the half-light, their breath visible in the cold, their boots leaving dark prints in the wet grass between hard stands. On the flight line, 63 P-51 Mustangs sit in neat rows, their aluminum skin beaded with moisture, their propellers still. The smell is overwhelming here: high-octane gasoline, engine oil, hydraulic fluid, the metallic tang of gunpowder residue still clinging to wing-mounted 50 caliber machine guns from yesterday's mission. A young crew chief from Michigan, barely 20 years old, stands beside the fuselage of a Mustang designated B6S, running his hand along the wing's leading edge, checking for stress fractures. He does not know that within 2 hours, this aircraft will penetrate deeper into German airspace than any Allied fighter has managed since the war began. He does not know that the fuel mixture in its tanks, a formula that every technical manual declares unsafe, that every engineering officer has warned against, will carry it to Berlin and back. He knows only that the engine sounds different this morning when they run it up, rougher, angrier, hungry. The strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany was by early 1944 in crisis. For 18 months, the United States Army Air Forces had sent waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into occupied Europe, targeting factories, refineries, rail yards, the industrial skeleton that sustained Hitler's war machine. The theory was elegant: daylight precision bombing, flying in tight formations for mutual defensive firepower, would systematically dismantle German production capacity while minimizing civilian casualties. The reality was catastrophic. German fighter pilots, flying Focke-Wulf 190S and Messerschmitt 109S from bases scattered across the Reich, tore into bomber formations with devastating effectiveness. On August 17, 1943, during raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers in a single day, 600 men killed, missing or captured. On October 14, a second Schweinfurt raid cost 62 more. The losses were unsustainable. Bomber crews faced statistical odds worse than infantrymen on the front lines. Each mission was a coin flip. 25 missions meant survival was a mathematical improbability. The problem was elementary and intractable: range. American fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could escort the bombers partway into Germany, perhaps as far as the Rhine, but their fuel capacity limited them to perhaps 400 miles from base. Beyond that line, the bombers flew alone, and German fighters waited for precisely that moment. They had learned to track the formations, to watch the escorts turn back, and then to attack with concentrated fury. Luftwaffe pilots called the unescorted bombers Wehrmotts, four motors, and spoke of them with a hunter's cold appreciation. They were slow, predictable, and without fighter cover, they died in appalling numbers. American strategic planners understood the geometry of the problem with perfect clarity. To bomb Berlin, Stuttgart, Leipzig, the cities where German aircraft production was concentrated, required penetrating 600 miles into enemy territory. To do so without prohibitive losses required fighter escort all the way to the target and back. But no fighter in the Allied inventory could fly 1,200 miles, engage in combat, and return home. The laws of physics and fuel consumption were immutable, or so it seemed. The North American P-51 Mustang arrived in Europe in late 1943 as an afterthought, a hybrid born of necessity and accident. Designed originally for the British, powered by an American airframe and a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it possessed speed and maneuverability that matched or exceeded anything in the Luftwaffe. But like all fighters, it was limited by fuel. Its internal tanks held 269 gallons, enough for perhaps 600 miles of combat radius, better than the Thunderbolt, insufficient for Berlin. Engineers developed external drop tanks, disposable fuel containers slung beneath the wings, that extended range to perhaps 700 miles. Still not enough. By January 1944, the 8th Air Force possessed hundreds of Mustangs and no clear path to using them for the missions that mattered most. The men who flew these aircraft understood the stakes with intimate clarity. They had watched bomber formations depart for Germany and return with aircraft shot to pieces, with dead gunners still in their turrets, with wings shredded and hydraulic fluid streaming from punctured lines. They had attended memorial services for entire crews lost over Brunswick or Kassel. They knew that strategic bombing was failing not because the bombers were ineffective, but because they could not reach their targets and survive. The war would be won or lost on this question: could fighters be made to go the distance? Lieutenant Colonel Cass Herr was not, by conventional measures, an engineering genius. He was a pilot, a commander, a pragmatist with combat experience, and a talent for seeing past bureaucratic constraints. In early 1944, serving with 8th Fighter Command, he became obsessed with the fuel question. The Mustang's problem, he recognized, was not aerodynamic. The aircraft handled beautifully, even with drop tanks. The problem was that fuel consumption rates, calculated by manufacturer engineers and validated by Army Air Force's technical staff, assumed specific operational parameters, specific throttle settings, specific mixture ratios of fuel to air in the engine, specific climb profiles and cruise speeds. These parameters had been established to maximize engine life and minimize mechanical failure. They were conservative, cautious, designed by men who would never fly the aircraft into combat. Ho began asking a different question. What if the engines could be pushed beyond their rated specifications? What if pilots accepted greater risk of mechanical failure in exchange for greater range? The Merlin engine in the Mustang was a magnificent piece of engineering, capable of producing over 1,500 horsepower at war emergency power. But that power came at a cost: fuel consumption that emptied tanks in hours. At lower power settings, at leaner fuel mixtures, the engine consumed less. The manufacturer specifications warned against running too lean. The mixture could cause detonation, engine damage, catastrophic failure. But what if pilots were willing to accept that risk? What if, for the sake of reaching Berlin, they flew their engines at the ragged edge of failure? Ho was not alone in this thinking. Captain Chuck Yeager, who would later break the sound barrier, flew Mustangs in Europe and later recalled the fuel management strategies that pilots developed through trial and error. We learned to lean the mixture way out, run the engines cooler and slower than the book said. Yeah, you risked fouling the plugs or damaging the engine, but you could squeeze another hour out of your fuel, and that hour meant everything. Other pilots corroborated this approach. They discovered that by reducing throttle to cruise settings, barely above stall speed, by leaning the fuel mixture until the engine ran rough but did not quit, they could extend their operational radius far beyond what the technical manuals promised. But individual experimentation was not enough. What Hoss sought was a standardized procedure, a fuel management protocol that could be taught to every Mustang pilot, that would reliably deliver the range needed for Berlin escort missions. In February 1944, working with a small group of engineering officers and experienced pilots, he began conducting systematic tests. Mustangs were flown on measured courses at various altitudes, at various mixture settings, with fuel consumption precisely recorded. The data accumulated slowly, each test flight adding a few data points to a growing body of empirical knowledge. What emerged was surprising and slightly terrifying. By operating the Merlin engine at extremely lean mixtures that produced visible roughness in engine performance, that made the aircraft shudder slightly, that every instinct warned against, pilots could reduce fuel consumption by as much as 30%. 30%. It was the difference between Frankfurt and Berlin, between turning back and pressing on, between strategic failure and strategic possibility. The formula Ho developed was deceptively simple but psychologically difficult. At altitude, cruising toward Germany, pilots would gradually lean their fuel mixture, pulling back on the mixture control lever, until the engine RPM began to fluctuate, until the smooth roar became a rougher, more irregular sound. They would hold it there, right at the edge of stalling the engine, for hours. Every pilot instinct screamed against this. A smooth-running engine meant reliability, safety, the possibility of making it home. A rough engine suggested imminent failure, the nightmare of going down over enemy territory. But the mathematics were undeniable. The roughness was not damage. it was efficiency. The engine was extracting every possible mile from every gallon of fuel, operating at the thermodynamic edge of combustion chemistry. When Hoth presented his findings to V-8 Fighter Command Headquarters, the response was institutional resistance masquerading as technical caution. Engineering officers cited manufacturer specifications. They warned of engine failures, of pilots going down over Germany because they had destroyed their engines trying to save fuel. They noted correctly that the procedure violated every established protocol for engine operation. Hoth countered with data, flight logs, fuel consumption records, the testimony of pilots who had used the technique and returned safely. The debate escalated to Major General William Kepner, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, a pragmatist who understood that the strategic bombing campaign was on the verge of collapse without long-range fighter escort. Kepner made the decision in early March, authorized the fuel management procedure, trained pilots in its use, and launched the first Berlin escort mission at the earliest opportunity. It was, in bureaucratic terms, the decision to void the warranty on hundreds of aircraft and accept the possibility that engines would fail, that pilots would be lost not to German fighters, but to American innovation. It was also the decision that would change the course of the air war over Europe. The training was hasty, conducted in squadron-ready rooms with pilots gathered around blackboards where fuel consumption curves and mixture settings were sketched in chalk. The instructions were precise: climb to altitude using normal mixture settings. Once at cruise altitude above 20,000 feet, gradually lean the mixture until engine RPM drops by approximately 50 revolutions per minute. Hold that setting. Monitor cylinder head temperature. If the engine begins to detonate, a sharp, metallic knocking sound, enrich the mixture slightly. Otherwise, fly it rough. Trust the mathematics. The Merlin can take it. You will make Berlin. You will come home. Some pilots embraced the procedure immediately, trusting the data and eager for the chance to finally escort bombers all the way to the heart of the Reich. Others were skeptical, reluctant to abuse engines they had come to regard as reliable partners, but all understood what was at stake. The bomber crews they were meant to protect had no choice about flying deep into Germany. The least fighter pilots could do was give them company all the way to the target. March 4, 1944, was chosen for the first Berlin escort mission, not because conditions were ideal, they were not, but because weather over Germany was forecast to be marginally acceptable, and the strategic need was overwhelming. 660 bombers were dispatched to bomb industrial targets in Berlin and surrounding areas. 801 fighters, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings launched to escort them. Among these, the Mustangs of the 4th Fighter Group, the 354th Fighter Group, and the 357th Fighter Group would attempt the full penetration to Berlin and back, a round-trip distance of approximately 1,200 miles. The bombers droned eastward in vast formations, stacked from 15,000 to 25,000 feet, their contrails sketching white lines across the grey European sky. The fighters wove above and around them, weaving S-turns to match the bombers' slower speed, scanning the horizon for the glint of sunlight on canopies that would signal Luftwaffe interceptors. As they crossed into Germany, the Thunderbolts and Lightnings reached the limits of their range and turned back, waggling their wings in farewell. Now only the Mustangs remained, 60 miles inside Germany, 100, 200. The pilots checked their fuel gauges, leaned their mixtures as they had been trained, felt their engines settle into that strange, rough rhythm. Some later described it as flying on a prayer. Others said it felt like the aircraft was angry, straining against the leash, burning not smoothly but with a barely controlled violence. German radar operators tracked the formations as they penetrated deeper than any escorted force had managed before. Luftwaffe bases across northern Germany scrambled fighters. Mepo 109 say from Jüterbog, Futu 190 say from Stendal, entire Geschwader rising to meet what they assumed would be, as always, unescorted bombers once the American fighters exhausted their fuel. But the Mustangs did not turn back. They pressed on, crossing the Elbe River, passing Brandenburg, closing on Berlin itself. For Luftwaffe pilots climbing to intercept, the sight was unprecedented and deeply unsettling. The Americans had solved the range problem. The sanctuary of distance which had protected German skies for years had collapsed. The combat over Berlin that day was chaotic and sprawling. Hundreds of aircraft tangling at 25,000 feet, contrails marking the paths of diving fighters and bombers, struggling to hold formation through flak that turned the sky black. Mustang pilots, after hours of careful fuel management, suddenly pushed their throttles forward, enriching their mixtures, coaxing their engines back to full combat power. The rough growl became a roar. Pilots who had nursed their fuel for 3 hours now burned it freely, chasing Luftwaffe fighters through the sky over Germany's capital. First Lieutenant Robert Johnson, of the 61st Fighter Squadron, described the moment in his combat report. Engaged 3 May 109s at 24,000 feet vicinity Berlin. Pursued eastward for 15 miles. Destroyed 1 confirmed. Engine ran perfectly, despite 3+ hours at extreme lean mixture. The battle lasted 37 minutes. When it ended, the bombers turned for home, their bomb bays empty, and the Mustangs formed up around them for the long flight back to England. Now the fuel management became critical once more. Pilots leaned their mixtures again, watching their fuel gauges with obsessive attention, calculating constantly. Some would make it home with 20 gallons remaining, some with less than 10. A few would not make it, forced down by battle damage or mechanical failure or simple miscalculation, their pilots becoming prisoners of war in the wreckage of aircraft that had carried them farther than anyone thought possible. 61 of the 63 Mustangs that launched from Duxford that morning returned. The 2 losses were attributed to enemy action, not fuel exhaustion or engine failure from the unorthodox mixture settings. The mission was by any measure a success. More importantly, it was a proof of concept. Mustangs could reach Berlin. They could fight there, they could come home. The strategic equation had fundamentally changed. German military records from March 1944 onward reflect a growing sense of alarm at the Americans' newfound reach. Luftwaffe tactical reports began noting continuous fighter escort to target, and American fighters observed over Berlin. Reich Minister of Armaments Albert Speer, in his post-war memoirs, identified the arrival of long-range American fighters as the moment when German victory became impossible. Previously, our fighters could attack the bombers once their escorts turned back. Now there was no respite. The Americans came all the way, fought over our cities and returned home. Our pilots were fighting over their own airfields, with no fuel reserves, no margin for error. It was the beginning of the end. For the Mustang pilots, the psychological transformation was equally profound. They had expected to fight a defensive battle, protecting bombers, fending off attackers, playing a supporting role in the great strategic campaign. Now they found themselves hunting over Germany, engaging Luftwaffe fighters on their own airfields, asserting air superiority not over France or Holland, but over the heart of the Reich itself. The hunted had become hunters. The escorts had become attackers. And the key to this transformation was not a technological breakthrough or a new weapon, but a willingness to operate aircraft in ways the engineers had never intended, to extract performance from engines through pragmatism rather than protocol. The fuel mixture itself became a kind of talisman, a shared secret among Mustang pilots. They spoke about it in shorthand, in the coded language of men who understood that they were doing something technically forbidden and strategically essential. Running it rough meant you were committed, that you trusted the process, that you were willing to risk the engine to make the mission. The sound of the engine at lean mixture, that irregular, slightly violent roar, became the sound of possibility, of barriers breaking, of mathematics and nerve combining, to achieve what doctrine said was impossible. This sound, more than any other, symbolized the American approach to the air war. It was not the clean, precise hum of an engine operating within specifications. It was rougher, louder, less controlled. It was the sound of pushing boundaries, of accepting risk, of choosing effectiveness over elegance. German engines were marvels of precision engineering, maintained meticulously, operated within narrow parameters. They were beautiful machines, and they were not enough. American engines were workhorses, abused and overstressed, run beyond their ratings, and they delivered. The rough roar of a Merlin at extreme lean mixture was the sound of industrial pragmatism, of a nation willing to break its own rules to win. After March 4, Berlin escort missions became routine. Throughout the spring of 1944, Mustangs flew deeper and deeper into Germany, not just escorting bombers but conducting fighter sweeps, offensive missions designed to force the Luftwaffe into combat and destroy it through attrition. German fighter production continued, even increased, through the first half of 1944, but German pilot losses accelerated catastrophically. Experienced pilots who had survived the Eastern Front and the Battle of Britain were shot down over their own cities by American fighters. They could not shake, could not escape, could not outlast. The Luftwaffe bled veterans and replaced them with teenagers who had a dozen hours of flight training and died in their first combat sortie. The fuel management technique pioneered by Ho and refined through practical application spread throughout the 8th and 15th Air Forces. It was taught to new pilots arriving in England and Italy, incorporated into training syllabi, documented in updated technical orders that formally contradicted the original manufacturer specifications. North American Aviation, the company that built the Mustang, eventually acknowledged the procedure and conducted its own tests, validating what combat pilots had already proven: the Merlin engine could sustain lean mixture operations for extended periods without catastrophic failure rates. The company's engineers, who had designed the aircraft to strict safety margins, were forced to confront the reality that combat pilots, facing different calculations of risk, had discovered capabilities the designers had not imagined. This was, in microcosm, the story of the American war effort writ small. European military traditions emphasized doctrine, training, adherence to established procedure. The German military was particularly rigid in this regard, brilliant at executing planned operations, less adaptable when circumstances changed. The American military, staffed largely by civilians in uniform, brought a different culture. Problems were to be solved, not endured. If the manual was wrong, change the manual. If the engine manufacturer said something was impossible, test it yourself. This pragmatism was born of democracy, of a society that valued results over hierarchy, that trusted individuals to exercise judgment, that believed problems were puzzles to be solved rather than facts to be accepted. Cass Hove received little public recognition for his work. He was promoted eventually and continued to serve in operational planning roles. After the war, he returned to civilian life and rarely spoke about the fuel mixture experiments. The story was buried in operational reports and technical memoranda, noticed by historians only decades later, when researchers began examining how the Allies achieved air superiority over Germany. There are no monuments to Hove, no medals specifically citing his contribution to solving the range problem. But every Mustang pilot who escorted bombers to Berlin and returned, every bomber crew that survived because fighters stayed with them all the way, owed their lives in part to his willingness to question authority and trust empirical evidence over institutional caution. The Merlin engine, as installed in the P-51 Mustang, was rated for approximately 1,500 hours of operation before requiring major overhaul. In practice, combat conditions reduced this dramatically. Perhaps 300 to 500 hours was typical. Engines run consistently at extreme lean mixtures experienced additional stress, particularly to spark plugs and exhaust valves. Maintenance crews noticed increased fouling, more frequent plug changes, occasional valve failures, but these were manageable problems, solved with extra maintenance hours and spare parts. The alternative, losing the strategic bombing campaign and prolonging the war, was unacceptable. There is a particular violence to running an engine beyond its specifications, a sense of controlled destruction. Pilots describe the feel of it, the slight vibration transmitted through the airframe, the occasional backfire, the sense that the engine was not purring but snarling. It was uncomfortable, psychologically, to fly for hours with an engine that sounded angry. But it was also empowering. The aircraft was being pushed to its limits, and it was delivering. The engineers had built a machine with safety margins, with conservative tolerances. The pilots had discovered that those margins could be sacrificed, that the machine had more to give if you were willing to ask. This dynamic between designers who built for safety and operators who needed performance exists in every complex technological system, But in combat, the balance shifts. Safety is relative. The danger of engine failure must be weighed against the danger of being shot down, of leaving bombers unprotected, of losing the war, and in that calculus, running the engine rough made perfect sense. It was not reckless, it was a rational response to asymmetric risk. The engine might fail, but without the extended range, mission failure was certain. German pilots, interrogated after being shot down, expressed a mixture of respect and frustration at American tactical flexibility. One Luftwaffe major, captured in April 1944 after being shot down near Leipzig, told his interrogators, "Your pilots do not fly by the book. They improvise constantly. We are taught that the aircraft has limitations, and we respect those limitations. You seem to view limitations as suggestions." This was meant as criticism, but it identified precisely the source of American operational advantage. Limitations were suggestions, rules were starting points. The mission determined what was possible, not the manual. By June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies over Western Europe. The decisive factor was not merely the number of aircraft or the skill of pilots, though both mattered. It was the ability of American fighters to engage German aircraft anywhere in the Reich, to hunt them at their bases, to maintain continuous pressure that allowed no respite. The range that made this possible came from external tanks, from improved logistics, and from a fuel management technique that squeezed every possible mile from every gallon. The combination was overwhelming. German aircraft production actually peaked in 1944, with over 39,000 aircraft manufactured despite relentless Allied bombing, but production numbers were meaningless without pilots to fly them and fuel to power them. The fuel situation was critical. By autumn 1944, even when aircraft were available, Luftwaffe units often could not fly training missions because refined aviation gasoline was needed for combat operations. And those combat operations increasingly were defensive scrambles against Allied formations that appeared without warning, struck with overwhelming force, and disappeared before effective response could be organized. The Mustang, operating at extreme lean mixture, had become the tool that broke the Luftwaffe, not through any single dramatic victory, but through the accumulation of 1,000 small encounters, each one draining German resources, killing German pilots, forcing German commanders to conserve forces that were then destroyed on the ground by bombing. It was attrition warfare conducted with industrial efficiency, and it worked because American pilots were willing to fly their engines in ways that German pilots, bound by stricter doctrine and more rigid command structures, would not consider. There is a recording, preserved in the National Archives, of a radio transmission from March 4, 1944. The voice belongs to a P-51 pilot, identity unknown, transmitted over the squadron frequency somewhere over Berlin. The quality is poor. Static and interference nearly overwhelm the words, but the content is clear. Running rough, running lean, and we're still here. They can't shake us. We own the sky. The transmission lasts 7 seconds. In those 7 seconds is encapsulated the entire transformation of the strategic air campaign, from desperate defensive struggle to offensive dominance, enabled by a willingness to push machines beyond their rated limits, and trust that they would hold. The engine sound, rough, irregular, powerful, became symbolic of something larger than fuel management or fighter tactics. It represented a philosophical approach to warfare and to problem-solving that was distinctly American. European military traditions, built over centuries, emphasized perfection of form, adherence to doctrine, the slow accumulation of knowledge through official channels. The American approach, forged in a younger nation with less regard for tradition, emphasized getting the job done, questioning authority, trying what worked rather than what was prescribed. This was not always an advantage. American forces made mistakes, suffered unnecessary casualties, repeated errors that older militaries had learned to avoid. But in the specific context of extending fighter range in 1944, the American approach was exactly what was needed. Cass Howe, and the pilots who validated his fuel management technique, were not rebels or mavericks in the romantic sense. They were professionals doing their jobs, operating within a military hierarchy that was at its best, flexible enough to accommodate innovation from below. The bureaucracy could have crushed Hull's experiments, could have insisted on manufacturer specifications, could have prioritized engine longevity over operational range. To its credit, it did not. Senior officers, faced with compelling evidence that the technique worked, authorized its use despite violating peacetime standards. This institutional flexibility, the ability to recognize and scale good ideas regardless of their source, was as important as the technical innovation itself. In the post-war years, as aviation technology advanced and jet engines replaced piston engines, the fuel management techniques developed for the Mustang became historical curiosities. Modern engines, with computerized fuel injection and sophisticated management systems, operate within narrow parameters optimized by algorithms. Pilots cannot lean the mixture manually. The systems handle it automatically more efficiently than any human could. But the underlying principle, that performance often requires operating at the edge of specifications, that safety margins exist to be consumed when the mission demands it, remains relevant. The sound of the Merlin engine running rough has not been heard in combat for 80 years. The Mustangs that flew to Berlin and back have nearly all been scrapped, their aluminum recycled, their stories preserved only in archives, and the fading memories of veterans who flew them. But the legacy of that sound endures. It is the sound of barriers breaking, of the impossible becoming routine, of men and machines pushed to their limits, and discovering that the limits were farther out than anyone had believed. For the bomber crews who watched Mustangs escort them to Berlin and back, the sight and sound of those fighters were more than tactical assets. They were proof that someone cared enough to take risks on their behalf, to push boundaries, to refuse to accept that some targets were simply too far away. Every rough-running Merlin was a promise: you will not fly alone, we will go the distance with you, we will bring you home. In the calculus of war, where morale and psychology matter as much as bombs and bullets, this promise was a weapon as powerful as any gun. There is a field in Cambridgeshire where RAF Duxford once bustled with activity, where Mustangs lined the hard stands and ground crews worked through the night to ready aircraft for the next day's mission. The runways are still there, maintained now for historic aircraft and air shows. On certain mornings when conditions are right, a restored P-51 will take off from those same runways, its Merlin engine roaring smoothly, of course, operated within modern safety parameters by pilots who fly for pleasure rather than survival. The sound is close but not quite right. It is too clean, too controlled. The rough edge is missing, the angry snarl that once meant men were pushing their machines beyond the manual's limits in service of a mission that could not fail. But if you stand there early in the morning, when the air smells of dew and fuel, when the sun is just rising and the wind comes from the east, you can almost hear it, the sound of engines running lean, rougher than they should, carrying men toward a distant city, where bombs would fall and empires would burn. The sound of innovation born of necessity. The sound of democracy at war, pragmatic and improvisational, willing to break its own rules to preserve the principles behind them. Cass Huss did not fly to Berlin on March 4, 1944. He was on the ground monitoring radio transmissions, waiting for his fuel calculations to prove true or false, for his pilots to return or not return. When they landed, their fuel gauges hovering near empty, their engines still running despite hours of abuse, he did not celebrate. He simply noted the success, adjusted his calculations based on their feedback, and began planning the next mission. This was the work, unglamorous, technical, rooted in data, and tested through risk. No speeches, no grandstanding, just the steady application of reason and will to an intractable problem until the problem yielded. The fuel mix was insane by peacetime standards, too lean, too risky, too far outside the envelope of approved operations. But peace and war operate under different physics. In war, the insane becomes rational when the alternative is defeat. Running an engine rough becomes prudent when smooth operation means bomber crews die alone over Germany. And a simple adjustment to a fuel mixture control becomes the key that unlocks strategic victory, not because it was elegant or safe, but because it worked. March 4, 1944, was not the last day of the air war over Europe, but it was the beginning of the end. From that day forward, no German city was beyond reach, no Luftwaffe base was safe, no formation could hide. The sky belonged to whoever was willing to go farther, stay longer, fight harder, and in 1944, that was the Americans, flying machines they had pushed beyond their limits, trusting their engines to hold together for just a few more miles, just a few more minutes, just long enough to finish the job and come home. The roar of those engines, rough and powerful and slightly wrong, was the sound of freedom asserting itself through industrial might and individual courage. It was the sound of a fuel mix that every engineer said was impossible and every pilot proved was not. It was the sound of Berlin burning, and of American boys pointing their aircraft west toward England, toward safety, toward a world where innovation mattered more than doctrine and results mattered more than rules. In the end, that sound, more than any speech or symbol, was the sound of victory.